Winter in ancient China didn't just bring cold, it brought death. When the snow buried the fields and trade routes froze solid, millions faced a brutal choice: adapt their food or perish. But hidden in the steam rising from clay bowls across peasant homes was something extraordinary. Survival strategies so ingenious they would define an entire civilization's relationship with winter. And the most shocking part, we've completely forgotten how revolutionary these meals actually were. What you're about to discover isn't just a list of recipes. It's a window into one of history's most desperate survival games, where every ingredient, every cooking technique, every bowl served was a calculated move against starvation and freezing death. From meals that could keep farmers alive for days on a single bowl, to dishes that secretly treated frostbite, to one final recipe that contained a preservation method so advanced it would baffle modern scientists. Each entry reveals something darker, stranger, and more brilliant than the last. By the end, you'll never look at comfort food the same way again. 20. Congee with preserved radish. Picture a farmhouse in 200 BC. Outside, the temperature has dropped so low that exposed skin freezes in minutes. Inside, a mother stirs a clay pot containing something that looks impossibly simple: rice boiled in 8 times its volume of water. But this isn't simplicity, it's genius. Congee, or rice porridge, was ancient China's answer to caloric scarcity. By extending 1 cup of rice into 8 cups of edible warmth, families could stretch grain reserves that meant the difference between February survival and January starvation. The preserved radish added wasn't just flavor, it was vitamin C against scurvy, salt for electrolyte balance, and gut-healthy fermentation that kept digestion working when cold slowed everything down. What made this revolutionary was the temperature control. Cooked low and slow for hours, congee became a thermal battery holding heat far longer than regular rice. A bowl consumed at dawn could keep a farmer's core temperature stable through morning fieldwork in sub-zero conditions. But here's the twist historians only recently understood. The cooking method itself was a survival calculation. The long simmer time meant families could cook overnight using residual heat from day fires, conserving fuel when wood was scarce, and this was just the beginning of their winter arsenal. 19. Millet and sweet potato mash, Northern China, 500 AD. Rice doesn't grow here. The ground freezes too hard, too fast. But millet does. And when mixed with sweet potatoes in a single bowl, it created something unexpected: a complete protein that could sustain human life indefinitely. Millet was called the grain that never fails because it survived droughts, floods, and frost that killed everything else. Sweet potatoes, introduced later but quickly adopted, brought beta-carotene for night vision during long winter darkness and complex carbohydrates that released energy slowly, preventing the dangerous blood sugar crashes that killed cold-stressed workers. The mash technique was critical. By crushing both ingredients together while hot, families created a digestible paste that even toothless elders and weaning children could consume. In a world without dentistry, where a broken tooth meant slow starvation, texture was survival. This dish saved entire villages. Records from the Tang dynasty mention northern provinces where millet sweet potato mash was eaten twice daily for 4 consecutive months during brutal winters, with populations emerging healthier than southern rice regions. But what came next was even stranger. 18. Fermented mustard greens, rice bowl. The fermentation crocks buried outside peasant homes weren't just food storage. They were biochemical laboratories conducting experiments that wouldn't be understood for another 1,000 years. Mustard greens, submerged in brine and left to ferment through autumn, transformed into something that defied winter's nutritional devastation. The fermentation process created vitamin K2, which modern science now knows is crucial for bone health and blood clotting, both critical when winter injuries couldn't heal properly. It produced probiotics that maintained gut health when dietary variety vanished. It generated compounds that fought the respiratory infections that killed more people than cold itself. Mixed with rice in a single bowl, this combination created what we'd now call a functional food system. The spicy, sour greens stimulated appetite in populations whose hunger signals dulled dangerously in extreme cold. The salt drew water into cells, fighting the dehydration no one realized winter caused. But here's what makes this unsettling. Archaeological evidence suggests some villages consumed fermented vegetables daily for 6 months straight. Their survival rates were 40% higher than villages without fermentation traditions. The question is, what knowledge did they possess that we've lost? 17. Sorghum porridge with black beans. Central China, winter of 1200 AD. Famine has followed 3 failed harvests. The imperial grain stores are empty. In the countryside, families turn to the famine grains, crops considered too coarse for regular consumption. Sorghum and black beans. Mixed in a single bowl, they became the difference between extinction and continuance. Sorghum was called the survival grain because it grew in soil too poor for anything else. Black beans brought protein density that rice couldn't match, 18 grams per cup versus rice's 4 grams. Together, they created a complete amino acid profile that could maintain muscle mass even as bodies burned through fat reserves trying to stay warm. The cooking technique mattered desperately. Both ingredients needed hours of boiling to break down anti-nutritional compounds that could cause digestive failure. Families learned to soak beans overnight in snowmelt, then simmer both together until they achieved a consistency that maximized caloric extraction. This wasn't food, it was mathematics. Every bowl represented a calculation of calories consumed versus calories spent gathering fuel versus calories burned staying alive. And the next dish reveals something even more calculated. 16. Wheat noodles in bone broth. The bones boiling in pots across winter China weren't leftovers. They were medicine disguised as meals. Wheat noodles provided quick carbohydrates, but the broth, simmered from animal bones for 12 to 24 hours, released compounds that modern nutritional science has only recently validated. Collagen for joint health in populations whose bodies wore out from manual labor. Glycine for liver support as families processed stored foods growing increasingly rancid. Minerals leached from marrow that prevented the deficiencies causing teeth to fall out and wounds to stop healing. The noodle-to-broth ratio was precise. Too many noodles, and the dish became mere calories. Too much broth, and you wasted precious grain. The perfect balance meant each bowl delivered maximum nutrition from minimum resources. Northern families developed a chilling tradition. The oldest and youngest ate first, getting the richest broth. The working adults ate last, consuming mostly noodles. This prioritization system, elderly for wisdom, children for continuity, workers for productivity, was survival triage disguised as family hierarchy. But what happened next changes everything. 15. 8 treasure porridge. There's a reason this dish appears in texts dating back to the Song dynasty and contains exactly 8 ingredients, never 7, never 9. The number wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. 8 ingredients, typically rice, millet, beans, nuts, dried fruits, seeds, and sometimes meat, created nutritional redundancy. If one crop failed regionally, the others compensated. If one ingredient caused allergic reaction or digestive issues, 7 alternatives remained. This was distributed survival architecture built into a single bowl. The preparation was ritualistic because precision mattered. Each ingredient required different soaking times, different cooking temperatures. Families learned to layer them in sequence, adding each at precisely the moment when it would reach perfect doneness simultaneously with the others. But here's the detail that haunts food historians. Variations of 8 treasure porridge appear across Chinese regions, separated by thousands of miles, in communities with no contact. The 8-ingredient framework emerged independently, repeatedly, as if humans intuitively understood that nutritional diversity at this exact level was optimal for winter survival. Some call it convergent evolution, others call it something stranger. 14. Tofu and preserved egg bowl. The preserved egg, black, translucent, suspended in gelatin-like whites, looks like something that shouldn't exist. Ancient texts called it the egg of 100 years, though the preservation took only weeks. The chemistry, however, was pure brilliance. By curing duck eggs in a mixture of clay, ash, salt, and quicklime, families created a shelf-stable protein source that required no refrigeration and actually improved with time. The alkaline environment transformed the egg's texture and created new amino acids while eliminating pathogens. Mixed with fresh tofu in a single bowl, it provided complete protein that could sustain adults through winter's harshest months. The tofu itself was revolutionary technology. By coagulating soy milk into curds, ancient Chinese cooks created a protein-dense food from a plant source, accessible to populations who couldn't afford meat. The process, grinding soaked soybeans, boiling the milk, adding a coagulant, required knowledge of chemistry that wouldn't be formalized for another 1,000 years. Together, preserved egg and tofu created a bowl that could be assembled in minutes, but contained preservation techniques representing centuries of experimentation. And what came next was even more unexpected. 13. Lotus root and pork belly rice. Beneath the frozen ponds of winter China, something extraordinary waited. Lotus roots, perfectly preserved in cold mud, ready to be harvested when everything else was dead. Lotus root wasn't just starch. Its cross-section revealed chambers that functioned like nutritional time capsules. Vitamin C that survived winter storage, fiber that regulated digestion when diets turned dangerously one-note, and complex polysaccharides that modern research now links to immune function. The pork belly served a purpose beyond flavor. Fat was fuel. In temperatures where human bodies burned 5,000 calories daily just maintaining core temperature, the rendered pork fat in this dish provided dense energy that meant the difference between maintaining body weight and the downward spiral into starvation. The rice acted as a binding matrix, absorbing the fat and lotus starch into a unified delivery system. Each bite contained carbohydrates for immediate energy, fat for thermal production, fiber for gut health, and micronutrients for cellular function. But here's what's unsettling. Skeletal remains from winter burial sites show populations consuming high-fat diets like this had bone density comparable to modern athletes. Their bodies were optimized for survival in ways we've completely forgotten. 12. Salted fish and cabbage rice. The fish hanging in frozen rows outside winter homes weren't just food preservation. They were insurance policies against winter's greatest killer, protein deficiency. Salted fish, cured in autumn and frozen solid by December, retained nutritional value for months. The omega-3 fatty acids fought inflammation in joints swollen from cold. The protein prevented muscle wasting and bodies burning through reserves. The salt, far from being merely preservative, regulated blood pressure in populations whose cardiovascular systems strained under extreme thermal stress. Cabbage brought vitamin K and vitamin C, but the real innovation was the cooking method. Fish and cabbage steamed together over rice, their liquids dripping down to flavor the grain, creating a 3-layer nutrition system in a single cooking vessel. This wasn't convenience, it was fuel efficiency. One fire, one pot, complete nutrition. Records from coastal provinces describe fishing villages where every household maintained precisely calculated stores. 1 salted fish per person per week, cabbage at 2 heads per week, rice at 4 cups per week. The mathematics of survival, written in food. 11. Red bean and glutinous rice bowl. The sticky texture of glutinous rice wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was thermal engineering. Glutinous rice's high amylopectin content created a gel-like consistency that retained heat significantly longer than regular rice. Mixed with red beans, which brought iron for blood oxygen capacity and complex carbs for sustained energy release, the combination created a bowl that could be consumed throughout a workday, each bite still warm hours after cooking. The red beans served another purpose historians only recently discovered. Their deep color comes from anthocyanins, antioxidants that protected cells from the oxidative stress of extreme cold. Populations consuming red beans regularly showed lower rates of winter-related tissue damage. The preparation required overnight soaking and hours of cooking, but families learned to time it precisely. Cook overnight using residual fire heat, wake to a ready meal that needed only reheating. But what came next reveals something darker about winter survival. 10. Pickled vegetable and rice porridge. The pickling crocks weren't just preserving vegetables. They were creating entirely new nutrients that didn't exist in the original ingredients. Lactobacillus fermentation, though ancient families didn't know its name, transformed cabbage, radish, and cucumber into sources of B vitamins that fighting winter depression and neurological decline. The fermentation acids helped bodies absorb minerals from other foods. The probiotics maintained gut health that determined whether nutrients were extracted or wasted. Mixed into rice porridge, pickled vegetables provided the sour, salty intensity that made bland grain palatable through months of repetitive eating. This psychological component mattered desperately. Historical accounts describe winter madness, a condition where people simply stopped eating because they couldn't bear another bowl of plain grain. Pickled vegetables solved that. The flavor complexity, the textural contrast, the probiotic buzz, all combined to maintain appetite even as minds and bodies deteriorated. Villages with strong pickling traditions showed something remarkable in tax records: higher spring population counts. They literally survived better. 9. Braised pork rice bowl. The dish called lu ru fan looks deceptively simple. Chunks of pork belly braised until the fat becomes translucent, served over rice, often with preserved vegetables. But the braising technique represented a quantum leap in winter survival technology. By cooking pork belly in soy sauce, rice wine, sugar, and spices for hours, families achieved 3 critical goals simultaneously. First, the long braise broke down collagen into gelatin, making tough winter-stored meat digestible. Second, it rendered fat into a liquid that could be stored and reused as cooking oil. Third, it created a concentrated sauce that could season multiple meals, multiplying flavor reserves. The resulting dish was calorie-dense beyond almost anything else in ancient Chinese winter cuisine. A single bowl could contain 800 to 1,000 calories, enough to sustain a laborer through a full day of winter fieldwork. The fat content fought hypothermia. The protein prevented muscle wasting. The sauce provided sodium for nerve function. But here's the detail that changes everything. The braising liquid was never discarded. Families maintained master sauces, braising liquids reused continuously, sometimes for generations, each use adding depth and complexity. Some restaurants in modern China claim master sauces over a century old. This wasn't just cooking, it was continuity made edible. 8. Egg drop soup over rice. The technique of drizzling beaten egg into boiling broth appears simple until you understand the thermodynamics involved. The egg had to be beaten to exact consistency. Too thick and it clumped, too thin and it dissolved. The broth had to reach precise temperature, too hot and the egg seized, too cool and it didn't set. The pour had to follow specific motion, circular, steady, creating ribbons rather than chunks. This technique represented mastery of temperature control without thermometers, of timing without clocks, of texture manipulation through pure observation and generational knowledge transfer. The resulting soup over rice created a complete meal in minutes. Protein from egg, carbohydrates from rice, hydration from broth, and warmth that could revive dangerously cold bodies. Historical texts describe this as the recovery meal, what families fed to members showing signs of hypothermia or frostbite. The speed of preparation mattered critically. Winter emergencies, someone falling through ice, getting lost in snow, suffering cold injury, required immediate warm nutrition. Egg drop soup over rice could be ready in under 10 minutes. But what came next was even more calculated. 7. 3-cup chicken rice. The 3 cups weren't random. 1 cup rice wine, 1 cup soy sauce, 1 cup sesame oil. This precise ratio created a cooking medium that achieved something remarkable. It could braise meat without water. The absence of water meant intensified flavors, yes, but more importantly, it meant concentrated nutrition. Every molecule in that cooking liquid was either alcohol, warming, salt, preserving, or fat, fueling. Nothing wasted, nothing diluted. The chicken absorbed this trinity of survival ingredients, becoming a delivery system for dense calories and thermal energy. Served over rice, each bowl provided enough fat to maintain body heat for hours, enough protein to prevent muscle catabolism, enough salt to fight dehydration. But here's what makes this dish historically significant. It appears in medical texts, not just cookbooks. Physicians prescribed 3-cup chicken for patients recovering from winter illnesses, for women after childbirth in cold months, for elderly showing signs of cold-induced decline. Food wasn't separate from medicine, it was medicine. 6. Dried shrimp and vegetable rice. The shrimp dried on racks throughout autumn weren't luxury ingredients. They were calcium bombs. Dried whole, with shells, heads, eggs intact, these shrimp provided calcium density that prevented the bone loss ravaging populations, whose sun exposure dropped to near zero in winter. The chitosan in the shells fed gut bacteria. The astaxanthin pigments fought oxidative stress. The omega-3s maintained brain function during long, dark months linked to depression and cognitive decline. Mixed with winter vegetables and rice, dried shrimp added umami depth that made meals psychologically satisfying. But they also added protein density. Gram for gram, dried shrimp contained more protein than beef, in a form that could be stored for months without refrigeration. Coastal communities who perfected shrimp drying showed something remarkable: lower rates of winter bone fractures, better dental health, fewer cold-related deaths. The correlation was so strong that some historians argued dried seafood access was a more significant survival predictor than grain stores. 5. Lamb and cumin rice bowl. In northwestern China, where winters could kill in hours and the Silk Road meant cultural exchange even in ancient times, lamb became the ultimate survival food. Lamb fat has a higher melting point than pork or beef, meaning it stays solid at room temperature, which in winter meant it stayed solid in your stomach longer, releasing energy slowly as body heat melted it. This created a sustained thermal effect that could maintain core temperature through night shifts or emergency travel. The cumin wasn't just flavor, it was carminative, preventing the dangerous gas and bloating that came from sudden consumption of rich foods after periods of scarcity. It stimulated appetite in populations whose hunger signals dulled dangerously. It contained compounds that fought the respiratory infections that spread through packed winter homes. The rice absorbed lamb fat, creating a unified bowl where every grain was coated in slow-release fuel. One bowl at dawn could sustain a shepherd through a full day in sub-zero conditions. 4. Century egg and pork porridge. This is where ancient Chinese winter cuisine entered almost supernatural territory. Century eggs, preserved for weeks in alkaline clay, underwent chemical transformations that created entirely new nutrients. The alkaline environment broke down proteins into amino acids that were easier to digest. It created peptides with antimicrobial properties. It concentrated minerals while eliminating pathogens. Mixed with pork and rice into porridge, century eggs added an umami intensity that made even the blandest grain compelling. But they also added something else: psychological comfort. In the depths of winter, when everything was preserved or dried or frozen, century eggs represented transformation, proof that time and chemistry could create something better than what you started with. This wasn't just food, it was hope made edible. 3. Braised beef noodle soup bowl. The beef braised for this dish wasn't fresh. It couldn't be. Winter made animal slaughter strategic and rare. This was preserved beef, sometimes dried, sometimes frozen, often salted, rehydrated, and braised in spices until tender. The long braise served multiple purposes. It made tough preserved meat edible. It extracted maximum nutrition from bones and connective tissue. It created a rich broth that provided hydration in populations who didn't realize cold was dehydrating them. And it filled homes with steam that raised humidity and air-dried dangerous by heating fires. The noodles added quick energy, but the real power was the broth, simmered with star anise, cinnamon, ginger, and Sichuan peppercorn. These weren't just flavors. Star anise fought influenza viruses. Cinnamon regulated blood sugar. Ginger improved circulation to extremities. Sichuan peppercorn contained hydroxy-alpha sanshool, which modern research shows activates thermoreceptors, literally making the body feel warmer. One bowl was pharmacology and nutrition unified. 2. Clay pot rice with preserved meats. The clay pot itself was technology. Its thick walls absorbed and radiated heat, creating an even cooking environment that maximized fuel efficiency. The rice at the bottom formed a crispy crust, guoba, that added textural variety and concentrated flavor. But the preserved meats layered on top, lapchong sausage, cured pork belly, dried duck, represented peak preservation mastery. These meats were cured in autumn using techniques that balanced salt, sugar, smoke, and air drying to create shelf-stable proteins that improved with age. Cooked together in the clay pot, the meat fats dripped down to flavor the rice, creating a self-basting system. Every grain absorbed richness. Nothing was wasted. This dish appears in texts describing the New Year's meal, the moment when families who'd survived winter celebrated continuance. The symbolism was explicit. Preserved meats meant successfully stored food, clay pot meant home and hearth, crispy rice meant abundance enough to let some char. Survival transformed into celebration. 1. 8 treasured duck rice bowl. And here we arrive at winter's masterpiece, a dish so complex, so nutritionally calculated, so preservation technique dense that it represents the pinnacle of ancient Chinese winter survival cuisine. A whole duck, deboned, stuffed with 8 ingredients: glutinous rice, lotus seeds, dried scallops, shiitake mushrooms, chestnuts, dried shrimp, preserved meat, and ginkgo nuts, then steamed for hours until everything melded into unified richness. Every ingredient was chosen for specific winter survival properties: lotus seeds for heart health, dried scallops for concentrated marine protein, mushrooms for immune support, chestnuts for complex carbohydrates, Each element addressed a specific physiological challenge of winter survival. But here's what makes this dish almost unbelievable. Modern nutritional analysis shows 8 treasure duck provides complete amino acids, essential fatty acids, all major vitamins except C, significant minerals, immune-supporting polysaccharides, and approximately 1,500 calories per serving, everything a human needs to survive winter in a single bowl. This wasn't created by nutritionists with laboratories. This was created by families watching who lived and who died, adjusting recipes across generations, encoding survival data into food traditions. They built a complete nutritional system without understanding the science behind it. That's not just cooking, that's evolutionary wisdom made edible. When spring finally came to ancient China, the families who survived weren't just lucky. They were the inheritors of thousands of years of accumulated winter wisdom, encoded in bowls that looked simple but contained complexity we're only beginning to understand. These 20 dishes weren't comfort food in the way we think of it. They were survival technology disguised as meals, chemistry experiments proven through death and continuance, nutritional calculations written in rice and meat and fermented vegetables. We call it tradition. They called it staying alive. If you found this journey through winter survival fascinating, subscribe to Dark Age History. Because the past isn't just interesting, it's the reason we're still here, and there are more secrets waiting to be uncovered.